Hello everyone, so here's our second video for day 2. We just had our first video which was talking about kind of some context for the introduction of your paper. So just to recap very quickly, the introduction has 3 components. It begins with creative context, which we just covered, and then it should transition into your thesis. So this video, since the thesis is kind of the main focus for today, is going to be entirely on things to work toward as you're crafting your narrative thesis. So let's jump to it. The narrative thesis should have 2 functions, which are to establish the frame, which in this case is going to be what is your story or what is your event that you're focused on. And then second is to give us a little preview of the bigger picture. And so I like to simplify it into the formula I have here, which is that you should include an event and then some sort of understanding, or as I like to call it, the bigger picture. So just to give some pointers, like I do when I'm giving any new type of essay for the class, I'm going to give you guys some advice about things that you should be working toward and things to avoid. So things that you should do for your thesis, I kind of have 3 main pointers that I like to share with you. The first one is you should present a clear and personal critique or framework. So obviously you're writing a narrative. You should set up something that's tied to your own experience somehow. So the example here, outings and dialogues during my British Nigerian cousin's visit to LA last summer impressed upon me the bonding of mixed experience across global regions, right? So here it's obviously personal, right? My British Nigerian cousin impressed upon me. So it's very much tied to the situation of a specific person's life. And then it also has some sort of a critique, right? What did it impress upon me? Well, that's the critique that's being given. So, point number 2, you should have one event and one understanding, right? Especially for a paper like this one that you're writing, which is only going to be 3 to 4 pages, you don't have enough time to give us a bunch of different life journeys, right? You need to narrow down the focus. So I said here you shouldn't have 2, you shouldn't have 3 or 10 points to focus on, you should have one. Again, looking at the example here, we have one event, which is the visit from the British Nigerian cousin, and we have one understanding, which is this bond of mixed race experience, right? So looking at your thesis, it should be direct, it should be personal, and it should be focused. Number 3 is that you should craft a worthwhile frame of analysis. And what I mean by this is it shouldn't be something that's super common, right? The more personal it is to your experience, the less likely it is that it's just going to be some random point that everybody would say about his or her life, right? So, an example of something that is way too obvious would be visits from family are empowering, even though it has kind of a context that could be a story and it has a little bit of a critique, we don't really have any idea what to expect. So, a revision would be, again, transitioning from something this simple to something a little bit more complex, like we have here at the top. So, those are things that you should be doing. Things to avoid, I have 4 of them here. The first one is to avoid announcing the subject matter instead of just telling it. This is something that I think we're taught to do in high school just as a way to help us know that the thesis should be our opinion, but now here with college academic writing, you should be working toward already understanding that this is going to be your own analysis and not needing to state that there. So the example here in this essay, I'm going to explain how. We don't need that, right? And then we simplify to the thesis. My first trip to a plantation impressed upon me the contrast between media simulation and actual experience and how unfortunate it is that the former too frequently guides current thinking, right? So the announcement isn't necessary. It's already clearly personal in the way that it's being set up, so we don't need that. Along similar lines, add unnecessary phrases like in my opinion or I believe. It's not to say that you can't include these throughout the essay, but it's just repetitive to include it within the thesis because we already know that the thesis is your opinion. Third thing to avoid is just stating a fact. So the example here, last summer my family and I visited a plantation in Louisiana. This sounds interesting, but I really have no idea, since it's just a fact, what the bigger picture is that you plan to explore. and that is a necessary part of a thesis. So the revision would be along the lines of the top statement. And then number 4, you should avoid stating or framing your thesis as a question. The example here, how did my family's plantation visit impact my view of current media? I'm not sure, and I'm not saying that you can't have a question like this within your introduction paragraph as part of the creative context. That could work. But as a thesis, since it needs to be an argument, it can't be in the form of a question. It needs to be a statement, right? Your particular critique needs to be very directly, not just an inquiry, but an actual argument. So, now that we've talked through things to do and things to avoid, let's look again at the thesis from Smith's essay from yesterday. So, I've copied it here. She says, but this month my own routine happened to dovetail 2 weeks in a row with a deeper cycle in the city, a repetition of accident and event, amounting to a plain song of city life, of the city as an organizing social principle, and to which perhaps all city dwellers are called upon to contribute in their own small ways sooner or later when their time comes. So, breaking this down, we have our 2 parts that we've been focused on as a part of the narrative thesis. We have her event, which, as I've said here, is the routine, as she says it, the repetition of accident and event, right? This is the actual story that we're trailing within her narrative. And then we have the understanding. The city is an organizing social principle, right? And I think that she kind of extends it a little bit more than maybe is necessary. It could have just kind of ended there. But you get the point here. At the beginning of the thesis, you're setting up what that event is, which we have very directly here and even with interesting imagery. And then we have a very simple yet broader critique. So I would say the event is something personal. The bigger picture is something a little bit larger and a little bit more universal, which we'll talk a little bit about later when we get into looking at what the goal should be for your conclusion.